Anna Kerr is a founder and Principal Solicitor for Feminist Legal Clinic. As Australian country contact for Women's Declaration International, Feminist Legal Clinic is the host of these regular webinars. Anna has worked as a solicitor for over 30 years across a range of areas and now specialises in human rights law on behalf of women and girls, as well as engaging in some environmental law on the side. Anna is involved in a number of other women's organisations, including the Women's Libary, Hague Mothers Group, Maternal Scholars Association, and most recently, Women's Platform for Action International, WoPAI. And now I'd like to hand over to Anna. Anna, please go ahead.
Hello, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen. So my talk should probably be called Conspiracy Theories 101, since every self-respecting conspiracy theory relates to the Freemasons, from what I can tell. But anyhow, we're trying not to get too deep into that. This will be a skim. This is a very big topic. I didn't realise when I started just how large a topic it was, but I can only just go very quickly over the surface of it. But I think we need a lot more feminist analysis of Freemasonry and other secret societies and the role they play in maintaining the patriarchy. This is just a quick warning. For those of you with a weak stomach, or if you're easily offended, this probably isn't a presentation for you. I also should say that I personally have no direct experience with Freemasonry or any of the other secret societies that will be mentioned. So, you know, I'm just doing this on the basis of research that I've done. So just officially, Freemasons claim the roots of their craft are in the medieval guilds of the stonemasons from the 1700s, which used secret handshakes and symbols to identify each other and their level of training and expertise. So the apron and the square and the compass were the tools of their trade and continued to play a symbolic role in modern Freemasonry, which of course is not restricted to those trades. Freemasonry is structured into lodges, and these are governed by larger bodies called Grand Lodges, and I'm sure you've seen their buildings around the place. To all accounts, Freemasonry can boast its members have included many members of the royal family, many heads of state, key individuals within the legal fraternity, eminent scientists, famous entertainers, artists, and musicians. I had no idea until I started this research just how many of the famous people in Western history, at least, are Freemasons, or were Freemasons. Indeed, in the Western world, it would seem if a man was famous, there's a better chance than not that he was a Freemason. So in view of this, you do not really need to be a conspiracy theorist to think the world is skewed in favour of those who claim membership of the Brotherhood. Aside from the seemingly well-grounded claims of nepotism and corruption, there are, of course, even more disturbing allegations that have been levelled against Freemasonry throughout history, and we might touch on some of those a bit later. However, the public persona of Freemasonry, which we kind of see images of, is that of an increasingly antiquated group of old men holding rather dull meetings with fancy aprons, secret handshakes, and some rather bizarre and creepy rituals. They claim to be focused on self-improvement and philanthropic work, and indeed they do continue to operate a lot of charities in our communities. But if that's all they do, why is it so secretive? And here's a picture of the largest lodge celebrating its 275th anniversary. This is in England, and pictured in that is the Queen's cousin, the Prince Edward, Duke of oh God, I thought I had it written down, but anyhow, the members of the royal family are very much involved in Freemasonry. So this next slide shows just how far their influence goes, because Freemasonry is difficult to pin down and study, not only because of the secrecy, but also because there's no one centralized body. So when I'm talking about Freemasonry, really, I'm talking about it in the broadest sense, to include the many quasi-Masonic and clandestine groups, as well as the many groups and degrees recognised by Freemasonry itself. the influence of Freemasonry is dispersed through its numerous offshoots and affiliated organisations, some of which are more mainstream community groups from which they can recruit members. So you'll see Rotary, Lions Club, Boy Scouts, all of these were established by individuals who were Freemasons. Freemasonry does not claim to be a religion itself, but it does share symbolism and mythology, not only from the Bible, but also from Judaism, Islam, and Eastern religions. Further, it would seem that many more recent religions, such as Mormonism or Seventh-day Adventists and the Pentecostal movement, have been established also by individuals who are originally Freemasons, and some of them incorporate rather similar rituals and symbols. There have been times when anti-Semitism has resulted in Jewish people being excluded from Freemasonry, causing the establishment of B'nai B'rith as an adjacent group to fill the gap. However, Masonic membership is no longer limited to Protestant Christians, but can be found across all cultures, religions, and political affiliations. While Freemasons now claim to welcome members from all religious traditions, the favour is not necessarily returned. For example, there has been open hostility towards Freemasonry from the Catholic Church throughout history, and various popes have banned members from joining as Freemasons. And instead, the Catholic Church has set up its own rival secret societies, which include Opus Dei and the Order of the Knights of Columbus, who were apparently seen at Jimmy Savile's funeral in their regalia, which is quite similar to that worn by Freemasons. So together with mainstream religions, these Masonic and quasi-Masonic societies have played a significant role in creating and maintaining patriarchal interests by accumulating power and influence through the use of secrecy, deception, and subterranean violence, and by necessarily limiting the involvement of women. So as we've talked about, the Freemasons, while they might be the largest and oldest and best known group, they're only one of a menagerie of weird and wonderful clubs and societies that cater to secret men's business. And I say men's business because although it's true that there are forms of Freemasonry and affiliate groups that cater for women and girls, in Anglo-American Freemasonry, women are still in the main excluded. Their own groups may be meeting, but they usually have to have male members present, and they're not invited to the inner sanctum of the male groups. So they're sort of separated. Fundamentally, these are fraternal societies. They're designed to provide a supportive brotherhood for men. In fact, some of the women's groups, the women are obliged to still call each other brother. So by the nature, these fraternal societies require men to keep secrets from the women in their lives as much as anyone else. The preoccupation with the exclusion of women is clear from Masonic initiation rituals, which require the exposing of the candidate's breast to ensure that they are not a female. Interestingly, the United Grand Lodge of England has indicated that men who identify as trans women should be allowed to remain Freemasons if they originally joined as men, which suggests that Freemasons fundamentally understand that it's not actually possible to change sex. Turning something off. The intention to exclude women is also evident in the traditional blood-curdling oath of the Master Mason, which among other things includes vows not to aid nor be present at the initiation of a woman. They also promise various other things, including keeping each other's secrets and promising not to cheat or defraud each other, not to have illegal carnal intercourse with each other's wives, mothers, sisters, or daughters, not to strike a fellow Mason, and to help fellow Masons when they're in distress. And this is no doubt what Freemasons claim to be the personal development and moral training that they provide to their members. It's somewhat disturbing that they are not specifically bound to follow these rules in relation to the rest of humanity, but only in relation to their fellow Masons. All right. So next question is, what is the G about? So while Freemasonry does not claim to be a religion, many Masonic groups do require members to have a faith in a god or a higher being. And it's suggested that the G in their logo stands for both God or geometry or grand architect of the universe. However, there are others who suggest that the G actually stands for Gnosticism, or a secret spiritual knowledge that has the potential to save the soul while upsetting the mainstream Catholic Church. Bit of a bonus. Gnostics challenge established authority and the very existence of an objective material reality. So it's a bit like postmodernism. It values individual experience over universally accepted objective reality. And certainly Freemasonry and Gnosticism share symbols and both delight in secrecy, and Gnostics also have initiation rites and rituals where they seek to achieve altered states and release the divine spark, which they believe is trapped in the material body. Some Gnostic sects believe liberation comes through radical freedom, including breaking social and moral norms. So we can only hope that that doesn't involve sexual depravity, including raping and eating babies, as has been alleged historically by the Catholic Church, as well as more modern conspiracy theorists. Masonic initiation rites are often humorously referred to as riding the goat, although Freemasons deny the involvement of livestock. Baphomet, or the sabbatic goat, is a winged hermaphrodite, often depicted with a pair of breasts, and this symbol is associated with the Knights Templar. And so, although it cannot be formally established that Freemasonry arose out of the traditions of the Knights Templar during the Crusades, there's a great deal of Masonic folklore and mythology that claims this is the case. And some of their degrees are actually called the Knights Templar degree. So ultimately, the Knights Templar were accused of heresy, blasphemy, idolatry, and homosexual practice, as well as financial corruption by King Philip IV of France, who was apparently greedy for their money, and he and the Pope went after the Knights Templar in 1307. So their leaders were arrested and burnt at the stake in a very Christian manner. So in view of this history, perhaps it is understandable that the Freemasons like to keep a low profile. I note that in some parts of Africa in the current time, people have coined a term anistocracy to refer to members of society who participate in Freemasonry and progressive and practice homosexuality in order to enrich themselves. So this suggests that Freemasonry may operate as a cover that gives men license and opportunity to engage in illicit homosexual sex, which is otherwise unacceptable to their communities. Who knows? It's difficult to be sure about any of this because even the majority of members of Freemasonry aren't let into the top level secrets. It seems the explanations provided to apprentices at the lower levels are not necessarily the full story. The rank and file Freemasons are both physically and metaphorically hoodwinked, as they are also made to wear a blindfold or a hoodwink in Masonic initiation ceremonies. And this is a picture of a traditional hoodwink on the screen. So whatever they're hiding, they certainly don't want women to know about it. The penalty that a Master Mason agrees to if he should break his oath is no less penalty than that of having my body severed in two, my bowels taken from thence and burned to ashes. But the entered apprentice, their oath merely involves no less penalty than to have my throat cut across, my ear, from ear to ear, my tongue torn out by the roots, and my body buried in the rough sands of the sea, a cabled toe's length from the shore. And then for the second degree or fellow craft, there is no less penalty than to have my left breast torn open, my heart and vitals taken from thence, and thrown over my left shoulder. This is all reminded me when I was reading this of found some of these manuals actually in my own grandfather's belongings. So I was able to access all these, but you can also find them online. But it reminded me of something the pirates would say in the novels of Robert Louis Stevenson. And of course, I looked up Robert Louis Stevenson, and of course, he was a Freemason. And the Jolly Roger, or the skull and crossbones, is a well-known Masonic symbol. So then I went down another rabbit hole and found a whole lot of mythology connecting the Freemasons to the pirates, but we won't get into all that today because we'll run out of time. But we might scoff at all these oaths and rituals and symbols and secret handshakes as sort of schoolboy nonsense perpetuated now by a bunch of geriatrics, except we should bear in mind the knowledge that men really can be a bloodthirsty lot and that they may be capable of these kinds of unspeakable acts. And indeed, there is some significant evidence that Jack the Ripper's grotesque mutilations of his victims were inspired by these Masonic oaths. And according to some researchers, the police and establishment conspired to cover up that this was indeed the work of a Freemason, which some claim has now been confirmed by recent DNA evidence, but we won't go further into that. What we do know is that cults have long existed that engage in mind control, financial exploitation, and sexually motivated violence. What I found eye-opening was just how many of these cults, religious or otherwise, borrow from Masonic traditions and can trace their origins to a founder who once belonged to the Masons. A surprising number of these groups refer to themselves as the family, which is rather chilling, and they work to isolate members and supplant their existing familial and social supports. Typically, it's later revealed that the charismatic leaders were engaged in financial fraud and sexually predatory behaviour, mostly at the expense of hapless women and children, who are then left psychologically harmed and impoverished if they manage to escape ritual killings. So some of the notorious examples include Manson family, the People's Temple at Jonestown, and in Australia, the Family, which was also known as the Great White Brotherhood. Anyhow, you're probably saying, what's this all got to do with trans ideology? So let's have a look at that. So Karl M. Baer was a German-Israeli author and social worker, and he's claimed to be the first individual to undergo a female-to-male sex change operation in 1906. He wasn't technically a Freemason, but he was director of the Berlin Lodge of B'nai B'rith, which is the Jewish fraternity modelled on Freemasonry, established at a time when Jewish people were experiencing difficulty being accepted into Freemasonry due to anti-Semitism. They also accepted as a member Harry Truman, who then worked with them and others to help them establish the State of Israel after World War II. And yet Karl M. Baer provided a first-person account of being raised as a girl in his book, Memoirs of a Man's Maiden Years, which was written under the pseudonym N.O. Body. This book was very popular when published in 1907 and was twice made into a film in 1912 and 1919. Karl M. Baer, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it properly, but he's hailed as the first trans person to successfully have his sex changed on his birth certificate and to be granted the right to marry. Except none of this is accurate because he was not actually trans and it was not a sex change operation at all. This is because Karl M. Baer was raised as if he were a girl, but in fact he was always a boy. He was just a boy born with a disorder of sexual development. He had hypospadias. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right either. Anyhow, he shared his experiences of being raised female while he felt inside as if he was male. He shared those experiences with German physician and sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld, who collaborated with him in publishing his book. Hirschfeld then was operating a medical practice in Berlin through the 1920s, which was a hub for trans people, and he was arguably the first advocate for transgender rights. Under Hitler, his sexology research institute, however, was looted, had its books burned, and he was forced into exile. But he happened to be friends with Harry Benjamin, who used to visit his research institute on a regular basis, and then went on to experiment on men's genitals back in New York. Benjamin then published what became the first textbook on transgender medicine in 1966. In 1979, he founded the Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association, the precursor to the present-day WPAF, and he also hosted its first conference and released the first standards of care that same year. And that was the same year, incidentally, that Janet Raymond published her prophetic book, The Transsexual Empire. There was a lot happening around that time. I also just want to note that the rainbow is a symbol that was also associated with Freemasonry, particularly the International Order of the Rainbow for Girls, which was a youth organisation established in 1922. So that long predated its use as a symbol by the gay rights movement, which was only adopted in 1978. It was adopted by artist and drag queen Gilbert Baker. So, I mean, that's a symbol that's been co-opted. Apparently even George Washington, his ritual Masonic apron also includes on it a rainbow. Anyhow, back to 1979. That was a big year for the trans movement in Australia. Australia had its first conference on transsexualism in Victoria and founded a committee on transsexualism. At this conference, Dr. Michael Ross from the new gender clinic at Flinders University in South Australia presented a paper claiming that Australia had the highest incidence of transsexualism in the world. So South Australia, where this clinic was, that's a place that has a particularly strong Masonic history, being the home to the very first Grand Lodge formed in Australia. The first Grand Master of that lodge was the Chief Justice and Lieutenant Governor of South Australia, and subsequent masters also included many governors, judges, leading members of the legal profession. So South Australian politics were widely perceived as conservative and dominated by a powerful elite of establishment families. However, in the 1970s, under the Labor Premier Don Dunstan, South Australia was transformed into a centre of progressive politics. It became the first state to decriminalise homosexuality. Then, in 1976, there was sensational press coverage of the first known gender affirmation surgery performed in that state, and in 1978, that gender clinic was established at Flinders University. It was also in 1979, unfortunately, that there was a spate of brutal serial murders began. We had the murders of 2 of these 5 murders. There were 5 murders basically completed between 1979 and 1983. But aside from those murders, there were about 150 young males reported having been abducted off Adelaide streets, sexually tortured and released. Unfortunately for 5 of these young men, they didn't get released. A group of highly connected individuals were linked to the murders, and yet somehow only one perpetrator, an accountant called Bevan von Einem, was ever convicted. Names of high-ranking members of the legal and medical profession and business world in Adelaide were linked to the murders, but they've been suppressed by the South Australian court system, earning South Australia the title of suppression state. And these crimes, the modus operandi for these crimes involved inviting them to get into a car, and typically a member of the trans community was acting as a female decoy to help lure boys into the car, because they were otherwise reluctant to get into a car that was otherwise filled with men. A number of these trans individuals have been identified, but none of them have been held accountable for their role in facilitating these crimes, which apparently implicated elite members of Adelaide society. Several of these individuals, they had a house together where the boys were taken, where they were then assaulted. Now, some of those names, those individuals are public, but they're all of them, bar one, as far as I can tell, has passed away. They all died quite young. And there's one of them, of course, and he's living in Sydney, where he continues to be active in the older gay community, which is kind of disturbing. Look, anyone who wants more details of that, it's set out in this book by Debbie Marshall, who's an investigative journalist who looked into it. Obviously, any connection between these murders and Freemasonry is conjecture. However, we do know that Adelaide had a particularly strong Masonic history, and I have a lot more information. I've got a number of more slides, but I'm going to leave it there rather than go over time. The other interesting thing is the role played by some of the elite boys' schools, who seem to have a bit of a tradition of grooming boys into having relationships with members of the elite as well. I'm going to stop there because I could go on forever, and I think that will do for now. Thanks.
Goodness me, that was amazing. I don't know where you found the time to research that. I'm pretty sure you never sleep. So thank you. That was amazing. All right. I would like to thank our speakers. Thank you, Lavender. Thank you, Eileen Haley. Thank you, Anna Kerr. Fantastic presentations and so varied. That was really wonderful. I'm going to turn off our recording and then we can discuss.